Chapter 14. Percy and Padfoot. Harry was the first to awake in his dormitory the next morning. He lay for a moment, watching dust swirl in the chink of sunlight falling through the gap in his four-poster's hangings, and savored the thought that it was Saturday. The first week of term seemed to have dragged on forever, like one gigantic history of magic lesson. Judging by the sleepy silence and the freshly minted look of that beam of sunlight, it was just after daybreak. He pulled open the curtains around his bed, got up, and started to dress. The only sound apart from the distant twittering of birds was the slow, deep breathing of his fellow Gryffindors. He opened his school bag carefully, pulled out parchment and quill, and headed out of the dormitory for the common room. Making straight for his favorite squashy old armchair beside the now extinct fire, Harry settled himself down comfortably and unrolled his parchment while looking around the room. The detritus of crumpled-up bits of parchment, old gobstones, empty ingredient jars, and candy wrappers that usually covered the common room at the end of each day was gone, as were all Hermione's elf hats. Wondering vaguely how many elves had now been set free whether they wanted to be or not, Harry uncorked his ink bottle, dipped his quill into it, and then held it suspended an inch above the smooth yellowish surface of his parchment, thinking hard. But after a minute or so he found himself staring into the empty grate, at a complete loss for what to say. He could now appreciate how hard it had been for Ron and Hermione to write him letters over the summer. How was he supposed to tell Sirius everything that had happened over the past week and pose all the questions he was burning to ask without giving potential letter thieves a lot of information he did not want them to have? He sat quite motionless for a while, gazing into the fireplace. Then, finally coming to a decision, he dipped his quill into the ink bottle once more and set it resolutely upon the parchment. Dear Snuffles, hope you're okay. The first week back here's been terrible. I'm really glad it's the weekend. We've got a new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, Professor Umbridge. She's nearly as nice as your mum. I'm writing because that thing I wrote you about last summer happened again last night when I was doing a detention with Umbridge. We're all missing our biggest friend. We hope he'll be back soon. Please write back quickly. Best, Harry. Harry reread this letter several times, trying to see it from the point of view of an outsider. He could not see how they would know what he was talking about, or who he was talking to, just from reading this letter. He did hope Sirius would pick up the hint about Hagrid and tell them when he might be back. Harry did not want to ask directly in case it drew too much attention to what Hagrid might be up to while he was not at Hogwarts. Considering it was a very short letter, it had taken a long time to write. Sunlight had crept halfway across the room while he had been working on it, and he could now hear distant sounds of movement from the dormitories above. Sealing the parchment carefully, he climbed through the portrait hole and headed off for the Owlery. "I would not go that way if I were you," said Nearly Headless Nick, drifting disconcertingly through a wall just ahead of him as he walked down the passage. "Peeves is planning an amusing joke on the next person to pass the bust of Paracelsus halfway down the corridor." "Does it involve Paracelsus falling on top of the person's head?" asked Harry. "Funnily enough, it does," said Nearly Headless Nick in a bored voice. "Subtlety has never been Peeves' strong point. I'm off to try and find the Bloody Baron. He might be able to put a stop to it. See you, Harry." "Yeah, bye," said Harry, and instead of turning right, he turned left, taking a longer but safer route up to the Owlery. His spirits rose as he walked past the window after window showing brilliantly blue sky. He had training later. He would be back on the Quidditch pitch at last. Something brushed his ankles. He looked down and saw the caretaker's skeletal gray cat, Mrs. Norris, slinking past him. She turned lamp-like yellow eyes upon him for a moment before disappearing behind a statue of Wilfred the Wistful. "I'm not doing anything wrong," Harry called after her. She had the unmistakable air of a cat who was off to report to her boss, yet Harry could not see why. He was perfectly entitled to walk up to the Owlery on a Saturday morning. The sun was high in the sky now, and when Harry entered the Owlery, the glassless windows dazzled his eyes. Thick silvery beams of sunlight crisscrossed the circular room in which hundreds of owls nestled on rafters, a little restless in the early morning light, some clearly just returned from hunting. The straw-covered floor crunched a little as he stepped across tiny animal bones, craning his neck for a sight of Hedwig. "There you are," he said, spotting her somewhere near the very top of the vaulted ceiling. "Get down here, I've got a letter for you." With a low hoot, she stretched her great white wings and soared down onto his shoulder. "Right, I know this says Snuffles on the outside," he told her, giving her the letter to clasp in her beak, and without knowing exactly why, whispering, "But it's for Sirius, okay?" She blinked her amber eyes once, and he took that to mean she understood. Safe flight, then. And he carried her to one of the windows. With a moment's pressure on his arm, Hedwig took off into the blindingly bright sky. He watched her until she became a tiny black speck and vanished. Then switched his gaze to Hagrid's hut, clearly visible from this window, and just as clearly uninhabited, the chimney smokeless, the curtains drawn. The treetops of the Forbidden Forest swayed in a light breeze. Harry watched them, savoring the fresh air on his face, thinking about Quidditch later, and then he saw it. A great reptilian winged horse, just like the ones pulling the Hogwarts carriages, with leathery black wings spread wide like a pterodactyl's, rose up out of the trees like a grotesque giant bird. It soared in a great circle and then plunged once more into the trees. The whole thing had happened so quickly, Harry could hardly believe what he had seen, except that his heart was hammering madly. The owlery door opened behind him. He leapt in shock, and turning quickly, saw Cho Chang holding a letter and a parcel in her hands. "Hi," said Harry automatically. "Oh, hi," she said breathlessly. "I didn't think anyone would be up here this early. I only remembered 5 minutes ago. It's my mom's birthday." She held up the parcel. "Right," said Harry. His brain seemed to have jammed. He wanted to say something funny and interesting, but the memory of that terrible winged horse was fresh in his mind. "Nice day," he said, gesturing to the windows. His inside seemed to shrivel with embarrassment. The weather. He was talking about the weather. "Yeah," said Cho, looking around for a suitable owl. "Good Quidditch conditions. I haven't been out all week, have you?" "No," said Harry. Cho had selected one of the school barn owls. She coaxed it down onto her arm where it held out an obliging leg so that she could attach the parcel. "Hey, has Gryffindor got a new keeper yet?" she asked. "Yeah," said Harry. It's my friend, Ron Weasley. Do you know him?" "The tornado hater?" said Cho rather coolly. "Is he any good?" "Yeah," said Harry. I think so. I didn't see his tryout, though. I was in detention." Cho looked up, the parcel only half attached to the owl's legs. "That Umbridge woman's foul," she said in a low voice. "Putting you in detention just because you told the truth about how he died. Everyone heard about it. It was all over the school. You were really brave standing up to her like that." Harry's insides reinflated so rapidly he felt as though he might actually float a few inches off the dropping-strewn floor. Who cared about a stupid flying horse? Cho thought he had been really brave. For a moment he considered accidentally on purpose showing her his cut hand as he helped her tie her parcel onto her owl, but the very instant that this thrilling thought occurred, the owlery door opened again. Filch, the caretaker, came wheezing into the room. There were purple patches on his sunken, veined cheeks, his jowls were a-quiver, and his thin grey hair disheveled. He had obviously run here. Mrs. Norris came trotting at his heels, gazing up at the owls overhead and mewing hungrily. There was a restless shifting of wings from above, and a large brown owl snapped his beak in a menacing fashion. "Ah!" said Filch, taking a flat-footed step toward Harry, his pouchy cheeks trembling with anger. "I've had a tip-off that you were intending to place a massive order for dung bombs." Harry folded his arms and stared at the caretaker. "Who told you I was ordering dung bombs?" Cho was looking from Harry to Filch, also frowning. The barn owl on her arm, tired of standing on one leg, gave an admonitory hoot, but she ignored it. "I have my sources," said Filch in a self-satisfied hiss. "Now hand over whatever it is you're sending." Feeling immensely thankful that he had not dawdled in posting this letter, Harry said, "I can't. It's gone." "Gone?" said Filch, his face contorting with rage. "Gone," said Harry calmly. Filch opened his mouth furiously, mouthed for a few seconds, then raked Harry's rose with his eyes. "How do I know you haven't got it in your pocket?" "Because I saw him send it," said Cho angrily. Filch rounded on her. "You saw him?" "That's right, I saw him," she said fiercely. There was a moment's pause in which Filch glared at Cho, and Cho glared right back. Then the caretaker turned and shuffled back toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the handle and looked back at Harry. "If I get so much as a whiff of a dung bomb..." He stumped off down the stairs. Mrs. Norris cast a longing look at the owls and followed him. Harry and Cho looked at each other. "Thanks," Harry said. "No problem," said Cho, finally fixing the parcel to the barn owl's other leg, her face slightly pink. "You weren't ordering dung bombs, were you?" "No," said Harry. "I wonder why he thought you were then," she said as she carried the owl to the window. Harry shrugged. He was quite as mystified by that as she was, though oddly it was not bothering him very much at the moment. They left the owlery together. At the entrance of a corridor that led toward the west wing of the castle, Cho said, I'm going this way. Well, I'll see you around, Harry. Yeah, see you. She smiled at him and departed. He walked on, feeling quietly elated. He had managed to have an entire conversation with her and not embarrassed himself once. You were really brave standing up to her like that. She had called him brave. She did not hate him for being alive. Of course, she had preferred Cedric. He knew that. Though if he'd only asked her to the ball before Cedric had, things might have turned out differently. She had seemed sincerely sorry that she had to refuse when Harry had asked her. Morning, Harry said brightly to Ron and Hermione, joining them at the Gryffindor table in the Great Hall. What are you looking so pleased about? Said Ron, eyeing Harry in surprise. Quidditch later, said Harry happily, pulling a large platter of bacon and eggs toward him. Oh, yeah, said Ron. He put down the bit of toast he was eating and took a large swig of pumpkin juice. Then he said, Listen, you don't fancy going out a bit earlier with me, do you? Just to, give me some practice before training so I can, get my eye in a bit. Yeah, okay, said Harry. Look, I don't think you should, said Hermione seriously. You're both really behind on homework as it... But she broke off. The Morning Post was arriving, and as usual, the Daily Prophet was soaring toward her in the beak of a screech owl, which landed perilously close to the sugar bowl and held out a leg. Hermione pushed a nut into its leathery pouch, took the newspaper, and scanned the front page critically as the owl took off again. Anything interesting? Said Ron. Harry smiled. He knew Ron was keen to get her off the subject of homework. No, she sighed. Just some guff about the bass player and the Weird Sisters getting married. She opened the paper and disappeared behind it. Harry devoted himself to another helping of eggs and bacon. Ron was staring up the high windows, looking slightly preoccupied. Wait a moment, said Hermione suddenly. Oh no, serious? What's happened? Said Harry, and he snatched at the paper so violently that it ripped down the middle so that he and Hermione were holding half each. The Ministry of Magic has received a tip-off from a reliable source that Sirius Black, notorious mass murderer, blah blah blah, is currently hiding in London. Hermione read from her half in an anguished whisper. Lucius Malfoy, I'll bet anything, said Harry in a low, furious voice. He did recognize Sirius on the platform. What? Said Ron, looking alarmed. You didn't say... Shh, said the other two. Ministry warns wizarding community that Black is very dangerous, killed 13 people, broke out of Azkaban. The usual rubbish, Hermione concluded, laying down her half of the paper and looking fearfully at Harry and Ron. Well, he just won't be able to leave the house again, that's all, she whispered. Dumbledore did warn him not to. Harry looked down glumly at the bit of profit he had torn off. Most of the page was devoted to an advertisement for Madame Malkin's Robes for All Occasions, which was apparently having a sale. Hey, he said, flattening it down so Hermione and Ron could both see it. Look at this. I've got all the robes I want, said Ron. No, said Harry. Look, this little piece here. Ron and Hermione bent closer to read it. The item was barely an inch long and placed right at the bottom of a column. It was headlined, Trespass at the Ministry. Sturgis Podmore, 38, of number 2 Laburnum Gardens, Clapham, has appeared in front of the Wizengamot charged with trespass and attempted robbery at the Ministry of Magic on 31st of August. Podmore was arrested by the Ministry of Magic watch wizard Eric Munch, who found him attempting to force his way through a top security door at 1 o'clock in the morning. Podmore, who refused to speak in his own defense, was convicted on both charges and sentenced to 6 months in Azkaban. Sturgis Podmore, said Ron slowly. But he's that bloke who looks like his head's been thatched, isn't he? He's one of the Ron, shh, said Hermione, casting a terrified look around them. 6 months in Azkaban, whispered Harry, shocked. Just for trying to get through a door? Don't be silly. It wasn't just for trying to get through a door. What on earth was he doing at the Ministry of Magic at 1 o'clock in the morning? Breathed Hermione. Do you reckon he was doing something for the Order? Ron muttered. Wait a moment, said Harry slowly. Sturgis was supposed to come and see us off, remember? The other two looked at him. Yeah, he was supposed to be a part of our guard going to King's Cross, remember? And Moody was all annoyed because he didn't turn up. So that doesn't seem like he was supposed to be on a job for them, does it? Well, maybe they didn't expect him to get caught, said Hermione. It could be a frame-up, Ron exclaimed excitedly. No, listen, he went on, dropping his voice dramatically at the threatening look on Hermione's face. The Ministry suspects he's one of Dumbledore's lot. So, I don't know, they lured him to the Ministry, and he wasn't trying to get through the door at all. Maybe they've just made something up to get him. There was a pause while Harry and Hermione considered this. Harry thought it seemed far-fetched. Hermione, on the other hand, looked rather impressed and said, Do you know, I wouldn't be at all surprised if that were true. She folded up her half of the newspaper thoughtfully. When Harry laid down his knife and fork, she seemed to come out of a reverie. Right. Well, I think we should tackle that essay for Sprout on self-fertilizing shrubs first. And if we're lucky, we'll be able to start McGonagall's Inanimatus Conjurus before lunch. Harry felt a small twinge of guilt at the thought of the pile of homework awaiting him upstairs. But the sky was a clear, exhilarating blue, and he had not been on his firebolt for a week. I mean, we can do it tonight, said Ron, as he and Harry walked down the sloping lawns toward the Quidditch pitch, their broomsticks over their shoulders, Hermione's dire warnings that they would fail all their OWLs still ringing in their ears. And we've got tomorrow? She gets too worked up about work. That's her trouble. There was a pause, and he added in a slightly more anxious tone, Do you think she meant it when she said we weren't copying from her? Yeah, I do, said Harry. Still, this is important too. We've got to practice if we want to stay on the Quidditch team. Yeah, that's right, said Ron in a heartened tone. And we have got plenty of time to do it all. Harry glanced over to his right as they approached the Quidditch pitch, to where the trees of the Forbidden Forest were swaying darkly. Nothing flew out of them. The sky was empty, but for a few distant owls fluttering around the Owlery Tower. He had enough to worry about. The flying horse wasn't doing him any harm. He pushed it out of his mind. They collected balls from the cupboard in the changing room and set to work, Ron guarding the 3 tall goalposts, Harry playing chaser and trying to get the quaffle past Ron. Harry thought Ron was pretty good. He blocked 3/4 of the goals. Harry attempted to put past him and played better the longer they practiced. After a couple of hours, they returned to the school where they ate lunch, during which Hermione made it quite clear that she thought they were irresponsible. Then, returned to the Quidditch pitch for the real training session. All their teammates but Angelina were already in the changing room when they entered. All right, Ron, said George, winking at him. Yeah, said Ron, who had become quieter and quieter all the way down to the pitch. Ready to show us all up, Ickle Prefect? Said Fred, emerging tussle-haired from the neck of his Quidditch robes, a slightly malicious grin on his face. Shut up, said Ron, stony-faced, pulling on his own team robes for the first time. They fitted him well, considering they had been Oliver Woods, who was rather broader in the shoulder. Okay, everyone, said Angelina, entering from the captain's office, already changed. Let's get to it. Alicia and Fred, if you can just bring the ball crate out for us. Oh, and there are a couple of people out there watching, but I want you to just ignore them, all right? Something in her would-be casual voice made Harry think he might know who the uninvited spectators were. And sure enough, when they left the changing room for the bright sunlight of the pitch, it was to a storm of catcalls and jeers from the Slytherin Quidditch team and assorted hangers-on, who were grouped halfway up the empty stands and whose voices echoed loudly around the stadium. What's that Weasley's riding? Malfoy called in his sneering drawl. Why would anybody put a flying charm on a moldy old log like that? Crabbe Goyle and Pansy Parkinson guffawed and shrieked with laughter. Ron mounted his broom and kicked off from the ground, and Harry followed him, watching his ears turn red from behind. Ignore them, he said, accelerating to catch up with Ron. We'll see who's laughing after we play them. Exactly the attitude I want, Harry, said Angelina approvingly, soaring around them with the quaffle under her arm and slowing to hover on the spot in front of her airborne team. Okay, everyone, we're going to start with some passes just to warm up. The whole team, please. Hey, Johnson! What's with that hairstyle anyway? Shrieked Pansy Parkinson from below. Why would anyone want to look like they've got worms coming out of their head? Angelina swept past her long braided hair out of her face and said calmly, Spread out then, and let's see what we can do. Harry reversed away from the others to the far side of the pitch. Ron fell back toward the opposite goal. Angelina raised the quaffle with one hand and threw it hard to Fred, who passed to George, who passed to Harry, who passed to Ron, who dropped it. The Slytherins, led by Malfoy, roared and screamed with laughter. Ron, who had pelted toward the ground to catch the quaffle before it landed, pulled out of the dive untidily so that he slipped sideways on his broom and returned to playing height, blushing. Harry saw Fred and George exchange looks, but uncharacteristically, neither of them said anything, for which he was grateful. Pass it on, Ron, called Angelina as though nothing had happened. Ron threw the quaffle to Alicia, who passed back to Harry, who passed to George. Hey, Potter! How's your scar feeling? Called Malfoy. Sure you don't need to lie down? It must be, what, a whole week since you were in the hospital wing? That's a record for you, isn't it? Fred passed to Angelina. She reversed passed to Harry, who had not been expecting it, but caught it in the very tips of his fingers, and passed it quickly to Ron, who lunged for it and missed by inches. Come on now, Ron, said Angelina crossly, as Ron dived for the ground again, chasing the quaffle. Pay attention! It would have been hard to say whether Ron's face or the quaffle was a deeper scarlet when he returned again to playing height. Malfoy and the rest of the Slytherin team were howling with laughter. On his third attempt, Ron caught the quaffle. Perhaps out of relief, he passed it on so enthusiastically that it soared straight through Katie's outstretched hands and hit her hard in the face. "Sorry," Ron groaned, zooming forward to see whether he had done any damage. "Get back in position, she's fine," barked Angelina. "But as you're passing to a teammate, do try not to knock her off her broom, won't you? We've got bludgers for that." Katie's nose was bleeding. Down below, the Slytherins were stamping their feet and jeering. Fred and George converged on Katie. "Here, take this," Fred told her, handing her something small and purple from out of his pocket. "It'll clear up in no time." "All right," called Angelina. "Fred, George, go and get your bats and a bludger. Ron, get up to the goalposts. Harry, release the snitch when I say so. We're going to aim for Ron's goal, obviously." Harry zoomed off after the twins to fetch the snitch. "Ron's making a right pig's ear of things, isn't he?" muttered George as the three of them landed at the crate containing the balls and opened it to extract one of the bludgers and the snitch. "He's just nervous," said Harry. "He was fine when I was practicing with him this morning." "Yeah, well, I hope he hasn't peaked too soon," said Fred gloomily. They returned to the air. When Angelina blew her whistle, Harry released the snitch, and Fred and George let fly the bludger. From that moment on, Harry was barely aware of what the others were doing. It was his job to recapture the tiny, fluttering golden ball that was worth 150 points to the Seekers team, and doing so required enormous speed and skill. He accelerated, rolling and swerving in and out of the chasers, the warm autumn air whipping his face, and the distant yells of the Slytherins, so much meaningless roaring in his ears. But too soon, the whistle brought him to a halt again. "Stop! Stop! Stop!" screamed Angelina. "Ron, you're not covering your middle post!" Harry looked around at Ron, who was hovering in front of the left-hand hoop, leaving the other two completely unprotected. "Oh, sorry. You keep shifting around while you're watching the chasers," said Angelina. "Either stay in center position until you have to move to defend a hoop, or else circle the hoops, but don't drift vaguely off to one side. That's how you let in the last 3 goals." "Sorry," Ron repeated, his red face shining like a beacon against the bright blue sky. "And Katie, can't you do something about that nosebleed?" "It's just getting worse," said Katie thickly, attempting to stem the flow with her sleeve. Harry glanced around at Fred, who was looking anxious and checking his pockets. He saw Fred pull out something purple, examine it for a second, and then look around at Katie, evidently horror-struck. "Well, let's try again," said Angelina. She was ignoring the Slytherins, who had now set up a chant of "Gryffindor are losers! Gryffindor are losers!" But there was a certain rigidity about her seat on the broom, nevertheless. This time they had been flying for barely 3 minutes when Angelina's whistle sounded. Harry, who had just sighted the snitch circling the opposite goalpost, pulled up feeling distinctly aggrieved. "What now?" he said impatiently to Alicia, who was nearest. "Katie," she said shortly. Harry turned and saw Angelina, Fred, and George all flying as fast as they could toward Katie. Harry and Alicia sped toward her too. It was plain that Angelina had stopped training just in time. Katie was now chalk white and covered in blood. "She needs the hospital wing," said Angelina. "We'll take her," said Fred. "She, might have swallowed a blood blister pod by mistake." "Well, there's no point continuing with no beaters and a chaser gone," said Angelina glumly as Fred and George zoomed off toward the castle, supporting Katie between them. "Come on, let's go and get changed." The Slytherins continued to chant as they trailed back into the changing rooms. "How was practice?" asked Hermione rather coolly half an hour later, as Harry and Ron climbed through the portrait hole into the Gryffindor common room. "It was, Harry began. "Completely lousy," said Ron in a hollow voice, sinking into a chair beside Hermione. She looked up at Ron and her frostiness seemed to melt. "Well, it was only your first one," she said consolingly. "It's bound to take time to—" "Who said it was me who made it lousy?" snapped Ron. "No one," said Hermione, looking taken aback. I thought—" "Yeah, you thought I was bound to be rubbish?" "No, of course I didn't. Look, you said it was lousy, and I just—" "I'm going to get started on some homework," said Ron angrily, and stomped off to the staircase of the boys' dormitories and vanished from sight. Hermione turned to Harry. "Was he lousy?" "No," said Harry loyally. Hermione raised her eyebrows. "Well, I suppose he could have played better," Harry muttered. "But it was only the first training session, like you said." Neither Harry nor Ron seemed to make much headway with their homework that night. Harry knew Ron was too preoccupied with how badly he had performed at the Quidditch practice, and he himself was having difficulty in getting the chant of "Gryffindor are losers" out of his head. They spent the whole of Sunday in the common room, buried in their books, while the room around them filled up, then emptied. It was another clear, fine day, and most of their fellow Gryffindors spent the day out in the grounds, enjoying what might well be some of the last sunshine that year. By the evening, Harry felt as though somebody had been beating his brain against the inside of his skull. "You know, we probably should try and get more homework done during the week," Harry muttered to Ron as they finally laid aside Professor McGonagall's long essay on the Inanimanous Conjurer's spell and turned miserably to Professor Sinistra's equally long and difficult essay about Jupiter's moons. "Yeah," said Ron, rubbing his slightly bloodshot eyes and throwing his fifth spoiled bit of parchment into the fire beside them. "Listen, shall we just ask Hermione if we can have a look at what she's done?" Harry glanced over at her. She was sitting with Crookshanks on her lap and chatting merrily to Ginny as the pair of knitting needles flashed in midair in front of her, now knitting a pair of shapeless elf socks. "No," he said heavily. "You know she won't let us." And so they worked on, while the sky outside the windows became steadily darker. Slowly, the crowd in the room began to thin again. At 11:30, Hermione wandered over to them, yawning. "Nearly done?" "No," said Ron shortly. "Jupiter's biggest moon is Ganymede, not Callisto," she said, pointing over Ron's shoulder at a line in his astronomy essay. "And it's Io that's got the volcanoes." "Thanks," snarled Ron, scratching out the offending sentences. "Sorry, I only—" "Yeah, well, if you just come over here to criticize—" "Ron, I haven't got time to listen to a sermon, all right, Hermione? I'm up to my neck in it here." "No, look!" Hermione was pointing to the nearest window. Harry and Ron both looked over. A handsome screech owl was standing on the windowsill, gazing into the room at Ron. "Isn't that Hermes?" said Hermione, sounding amazed. "Blimey, it is," said Ron quietly, throwing down his quill and getting to his feet. "What's Percy writing to me for?" He crossed to the window and opened it. Hermes flew inside, landed upon Ron's essay, and held out a leg to which a letter was attached. Ron took it off, and the owl departed at once, leaving inky footprints across Ron's drawing of the moon Io. "That's definitely Percy's handwriting," said Ron, sinking back into his chair and staring at the words on the outside of the scroll. "To Ronald Weasley, Gryffindor House, Hogwarts." He looked up to the other two. "What do you reckon?" "Open it," said Hermione eagerly. Harry nodded. Ron unrolled the scroll and began to read. The farther down the parchment his eyes traveled, the more pronounced became his scowl. When he had finished reading, he looked disgusted. He thrust the letter at Harry and Hermione, who leaned toward each other to read it together. "Dear Ron, I've only just heard from no less a person than the Minister of Magic himself, who has it from your new teacher, Professor Umbridge, that you have become a Hogwarts prefect. I was most pleasantly surprised when I heard this news, and must firstly offer my congratulations. I must admit that I have always been afraid that you would take what we might call the Fred and George route, rather than following in my footsteps, so you can imagine my feelings on hearing you have stopped flouting authority and decided to shoulder some real responsibility. But I want to give you more than congratulations, Ron. I want to give you some advice, which is why I am sending this at night, rather than by the usual morning post. Hopefully you will be able to read this away from prying eyes and avoid awkward questions. From something the minister let slip when telling me you are now a prefect, I gather you are still seeing a lot of Harry Potter. I must tell you, Ron, that nothing could put you in danger of losing your badge more than continued fraternization with that boy. Yes, I'm sure you are surprised to hear this. No doubt you will say that Potter has always been Dumbledore's favorite, but I feel bound to tell you that Dumbledore may not be in charge at Hogwarts much longer, and the people who count have a very different and probably more accurate view of Potter's behavior. I shall say no more here, but if you look at the Daily Prophet tomorrow, you will get a good idea of the way the wind is blowing, and see if you can spot yours truly. Seriously, Ron, you do not want to be tarred with the same brush as Potter. It could be very damaging to your future prospects, and I'm talking here about life after school, too. As you must be aware, given that our father escorted him to court, Potter had a disciplinary hearing this summer in front of the whole Wizengamot, and he did not come out of it looking too good. He got off on a mere technicality, if you ask me, and many of the people I've spoken to remain convinced of his guilt. It may be that you are afraid to sever ties with Potter. I know that he can be unbalanced and, for all I know, violent. But if you have any worries about this, or have spotted anything else in Potter's behavior that is troubling you, I urge you to speak to Dolores Umbridge, a really delightful woman, who I know will be only too happy to advise you. This leads me to my other bit of advice. As I have hinted above, Dumbledore's regime at Hogwarts may soon be over. Your loyalty, Ron, should not be to him, but to the school and the ministry. I'm very sorry to hear that so far Professor Umbridge is encountering very little cooperation from staff as she strives to make those necessary changes within Hogwarts that the Ministry so ardently desires. Although she should find this easier from next week, again, see the prophet tomorrow, I shall say only this. A student who shows himself willing to help Professor Umbridge now may be very well placed for head boyship in a couple years. I am sorry that I was unable to see more of you over the summer. It pains me to criticize our parents, but I am afraid I can no longer live under their roof while they remain mixed up with the dangerous crowd around Dumbledore. If you are writing to Mother at any point, you might tell her that a certain Sturgis Podmore, who is a great friend of Dumbledore's, has recently been sent to Azkaban for trespass at the Ministry. Perhaps that will open their eyes to the kind of petty criminals with whom they are currently rubbing shoulders. I count myself very lucky to have escaped the stigma of association with such people. The minister really could not be more gracious to me, and I do hope, Ron, that you will not allow family ties to blind you to the misguided nature of our parents' beliefs and actions either. I sincerely hope that, in time, you will realize how mistaken they were, and I shall, of course, be ready to accept a full apology when that day comes. Please think over what I have said most carefully, particularly the bit about Harry Potter, and congratulations again on becoming prefect. Your brother, Percy. Harry looked up at Ron. Well, he said, trying to sound as though he found the whole thing a joke, if you want to, what is it? He checked Percy's letter. Oh, yeah. Sever ties with me? I swear I won't get violent. Give it back, said Ron, holding out his hand. He is, Ron said jerkily, tearing Percy's letter in half. The world's, he tore it into quarters. Biggest, he tore it into eighths. Get! He threw the pieces into the fire. Come on, we gotta finish this sometime before dawn, he said briskly to Harry, pulling Professor Sinister's essay back toward him. Hermione was looking at Ron with an odd expression on her face. Oh, give them here, she said abruptly. What? Said Ron. Give them to me. I'll look through them and correct them, she said. Are you serious? Oh, Hermione, you're a lifesaver, said Ron. What you can say is, we promise we'll never leave our homework this late again, she said, holding out both hands for their essays, but she looked slightly amused all the same. Thanks a million, Hermione, said Harry weakly, passing over his essay and sinking back into his armchair, rubbing his eyes. It was now past midnight, and the common room was deserted but for the three of them and Crookshanks. The only sound was that of Hermione's quill, scratching out sentences here and there on their essays, and the ruffled pages as she checked various facts in the reference books strewn across the table. Harry was exhausted. He also felt an odd, sick, empty feeling in his stomach that had nothing to do with tiredness and everything to do with the letter now curling blackly in the heart of the fire. He knew that half the people inside Hogwarts thought him strange, even mad. He knew that the Daily Prophet had been making snide allusions to him for months, but there was something about seeing it written down like that in Percy's writing, about knowing that Percy was advising Ron to drop him, and even to tell tales on him to Umbridge, that made his situation real to him as nothing else had. He had known Percy for 4 years, had stayed in his house during the summers, shared a tent with him during the Quidditch World Cup, had even been awarded full marks by him in the second task of the Triwizard Tournament last year. Yet now, Percy thought him unbalanced and possibly violent. And with a surge of sympathy for his godfather, Harry thought that Sirius was probably the only person he knew who could really understand how he felt at that moment, because Sirius was in the same situation. Nearly everyone in the wizarding world thought Sirius a dangerous murderer and a great Voldemort supporter, and he had had to live with that knowledge for 14 years. Harry blinked. He had just seen something in the fire that could not have been there. It had flashed into sight and vanished immediately. No, it could not have been. He had imagined it because he had been thinking about Sirius. Okay, write that down, Hermione said to Ron, pushing his essay and a sheet covered in her own writing back to Ron, and then copy out this conclusion that I've written for you. Hermione, you are honestly the most wonderful person I've ever met, said Ron weakly, and if I'm ever rude to you again, I'll know that you're back to normal, said Hermione. Harry, yours is okay, except for this bit at the end. I think you must have misheard Professor Sinistra. Europa is covered in ice, not mice. Harry? Harry had slid off his chair onto his knees and was now crouching on the singed and threadbare hearthrug, gazing into the flames. Harry? Said Ron uncertainly. Why are you down there? Because I've just seen Sirius's head in the fire, said Harry. He spoke quite calmly after all. He had seen Sirius's head in this very fire the previous year and talked to it too. Nevertheless, he could not be sure that he had really seen it this time. It had vanished so quickly. Sirius's head? Hermione repeated. You mean like when he wanted to talk to you during the Triwizard Tournament? But he wouldn't do that now. It would be too... Sirius! She gasped, gazing at the fire. Ron dropped his quill. There, in the middle of the dancing flames, sat Sirius's head, long dark hair falling around his grinning face. I was starting to think you'd go to bed before everyone else had disappeared, he said. I've been checking every hour. You've been popping into the fire every hour? Harry said, half laughing. Just for a few seconds, to check if the coast was clear yet. But what if you'd been seen? Said Hermione anxiously. Well, I think a girl, first year by the look of her, might have got a glimpse of me earlier. But don't worry, Sirius said hastily as Hermione clapped a hand to her mouth. I was gone the moment she looked back at me, and I'll bet she just thought I was an oddly shaped log or something. But Sirius, this is taking an awful risk, Hermione began. You sound like Molly, said Sirius. This was the only way I could come up with of answering Harry's letter without resorting to a code, and codes are breakable. At the mention of Harry's letter, Hermione and Ron had both turned to stare at him. You didn't say you'd written to Sirius? Said Hermione accusingly. I forgot, said Harry, which was perfectly true. His meeting with Cho in the Owlery had driven everything before it out of his mind. Don't look at me like that, Hermione. There was no way anyone would have got secret information out of it. Was there, Sirius? No, it was very good, said Sirius, smiling. Anyway, we better be quick, just in case we're disturbed. Your scar. What about? Ron began, but Hermione said quickly, We'll tell you afterward. Go on, Sirius. Well, I know it can't be fun when it hurts, but we don't think it's anything to really worry about. It kept aching all last year, didn't it? Yeah, and Dumbledore said it happened whenever Voldemort was feeling a powerful emotion, said Harry, ignoring, as usual, Ron and Hermione's winces. So maybe he was just, I don't know, really angry or something the night that I had detention? Well, now he's back, it's bound to hurt more often, said Sirius. So you don't think it had anything to do with Umbridge touching me while I was in detention with her? Harry asked. I doubt it, said Sirius. I know her by reputation, and I'm sure she's no Death Eater. She's foul enough to be one, said Harry darkly, and Ron and Hermione nodded vigorously in agreement. Yes, but this world isn't split into good people and Death Eaters, said Sirius with a wry smile. I know she's a nasty piece of work. No, you should hear Remus talk about her. Does Lupin know her? Harry asked quickly, remembering Umbridge's comments about dangerous half-breeds during her first lesson. No, said Sirius, but she drafted a bit of anti-werewolf legislation 2 years ago that makes it almost impossible for him to get a job. Harry remembered now how much shabbier Lupin looked these days, and his dislike of Umbridge deepened even further. What's she got against werewolves? Said Hermione angrily. Scared of them, I expect, said Sirius, smiling at her indignation. Apparently she loathes parhumans. She campaigned to have mer-people rounded up and tagged last year, too. Imagine wasting your time and energy persecuting mer-people when they're little toe-rags-like creature on the loose. Ron laughed, but Hermione looked upset. Sirius, she had said reproachfully. Honestly, if you made a bit of an effort with Creature, I'm sure he'd respond. After all, you are the only members of his family he's got left. And Professor Dumbledore said... So, what are Umbridge's lessons like? Sirius interrupted. Is she training you all to kill half-breeds? No, said Harry, ignoring Hermione's affronted look at being cut off in her defense of Creature. She's not letting us use magic at all. All we do is read the stupid textbook, said Ron. Well, that figures, said Sirius. Our information from inside the Ministry is that Fudge doesn't want you trained in combat. Trained in combat? Repeated Harry incredulously. What does he think we're doing, forming some sort of wizarding army? That's exactly what he thinks you're doing, said Sirius. Or rather, that's exactly what he's afraid Dumbledore's doing, forming his own private army, which he will be able to take on the Ministry of Magic. There was a pause at this. Then Ron said, That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard, including all the stuff that Luna Lovegood comes out with. So we're being prevented from learning Defense Against the Dark Arts because Fudge is scared we'll use spells against the Ministry? Said Hermione, looking furious. Yup, said Sirius. Fudge thinks Dumbledore will stop at nothing to seize power. He's getting more paranoid about Dumbledore by the day. It's a matter of time before he has Dumbledore arrested on some trumped-up charge. This reminded Harry of Percy's letter. Do you know if there's going to be anything about Dumbledore in the Daily Prophet tomorrow? Only Ron's brother Percy reckons there will be. I don't know, said Sirius. I haven't seen anyone from the Order all weekend. They're all busy. It's just been Creature and me here. There was a definite note of bitterness in Sirius's voice. So you haven't heard any news about Hagrid either? Ah, said Sirius. Well, he was supposed to be back by now. No one's sure what's happened to him. Then, seeing their stricken faces, he added quickly, but Dumbledore's not worried. So don't you three get yourselves in a state. I'm sure Hagrid's fine. But if he was supposed to be back by now, said Hermione in a small, worried voice. Madame Maxime was with him. We've been in touch with her, and she says they got separated on the journey home. But there's nothing to suggest he's hurt or, nothing to suggest he's not perfectly okay. Unconvinced, Harry, Ron, and Hermione exchanged worried looks. Look, don't go asking too many questions about Hagrid, said Sirius hastily. It'll just draw even more attention to the fact that he's not back. And I know Dumbledore doesn't want that. Hagrid's tough. He'll be okay. And when they did not appear cheered by this, Sirius added, When's your next Hogsmeade weekend, anyway? I was thinking we got away with the dog disguised at the station, didn't we? I thought I could... No! Said Harry and Hermione together very loudly. Sirius, didn't you see the Daily Prophet? Said Hermione anxiously. Oh, that, said Sirius, grinning. They're always guessing where I am. They haven't really got a clue. Yeah, but we think this time they have, said Harry. Something Malfoy said on the train made us think he knew it was you, and his father was on the platform, Sirius. You know, Lucius Malfoy? So don't come up here, whatever you do. If Malfoy recognizes you again... All right, I got the point, said Sirius. He looked most displeased. Just an idea. Thought you might like to get together. I would, but I don't want you chucked back in Azkaban, said Harry. There was a pause in which Sirius looked out of the fire at Harry, a crease between his sunken eyes. You're less like your father than I thought, he said finally, a definite coolness in his voice. The risk would have been what made it fun for James. Look, well, I better get going. I can hear Creature coming down the stairs, said Sirius, but Harry was sure he was lying. I'll tell you a time I can make it back into the fire then, shall I? If you can stand to risk it. There was a tiny pop, and the place where Sirius's head had been was flickering flame once more. Chapter 15. The Hogwarts High Inquisitor. They had expected to have to comb Hermione's Daily Prophet carefully next morning to find the article Percy had mentioned in his letter. However, the departing delivery owl had barely cleared the top of the milk jug when Hermione let out a huge gasp and flattened the newspaper to reveal a large picture of Dolores Umbridge smiling widely and blinking slowly at them from beneath the headline. Ministry seeks educational reform. Dolores Umbridge appointed first ever High Inquisitor. High Inquisitor, said Harry darkly, his half-eaten bit of toast slipping from his fingers. What does that mean? Hermione read aloud. In a surprise move last night, the Ministry of Magic passed new legislation giving itself an unprecedented level of control at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The Ministry has been growing uneasy about goings-on at Hogwarts for some time, said Junior Assistant to the Minister Percy Weasley. He is now responding to concerns voiced by anxious parents who feel the school may be moving in a direction they do not approve. This is not the first time in recent weeks Fudge has used new laws to effect improvements at the Wizarding School. As recently as August 30th, Educational Decree 22 is passed to ensure that in the event of the current headmaster being unable to provide a candidate for a teaching post, the Ministry should select an appropriate person. That's how Dolores Umbridge came to be appointed to the teaching staff at Hogwarts, said Weasley last night. Dumbledore couldn't find anyone, so the Minister put in Umbridge, and of course, she's been an immediate success. She's been a what? Said Harry loudly. Wait, there's more, said Hermione grimly. An immediate success, totally revolutionizing the teaching of Defense Against the Dark Arts and providing the Minister with on-the-ground feedback about what's really happening at Hogwarts. It is this last function that the Ministry has now formalized with the passing of Educational Decree 23, which creates the new position of Hogwarts High Inquisitor. This is an exciting new phase in the Minister's plan to get to grips with what some are calling the failing standards at Hogwarts, said Weasley. The Inquisitor will have powers to inspect her fellow educators and make sure that they are coming up to scratch. Professor Umbridge has been offered this position in addition to her own teaching post, and we are delighted to say that she has accepted. The Ministry's new moves have received enthusiastic support from parents of students at Hogwarts. I feel much easier in my mind now that I know that Dumbledore is being subjected to fair and objective evaluation, said Mr. Lucius Malfoy, 41, speaking from his Wiltshire mansion last night. Many of us with our children's best interests at heart have been concerned about some of Dumbledore's eccentric decisions in the last few years, and will be glad to know that the Ministry is keeping an eye on the situation. Among those eccentric decisions are undoubtedly the controversial staff appointments previously described in this newspaper, which gave including the hiring of a werewolf Remus Lupin, half-giant Rubeus Hagrid, and delusional ex-Auror Mad-Eye Moody. Rumors abound, of course, that Albus Dumbledore, once Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards and Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, is no longer up to the task of managing the prestigious school of Hogwarts. I think the appointment of the Inquisitor is a first step toward ensuring that Hogwarts has a headmaster in whom we can all repose confidence, said a Ministry insider last night. Wizengamot elders Griselda Marchbanks and Tiberius Ogden have resigned in protest at the introduction of the post of Inquisitor to Hogwarts. Hogwarts is a school, not an outpost of Cornelius Fudge's office, said Madame Marchbanks. This is a further disgusting attempt to discredit Albus Dumbledore. For a full account of Madame Marchbanks' alleged links to subversive goblin groups, turn to page 17. Hermione finished reading and looked across the table at the other two. So now we know how we ended up with Umbridge. Fudge passed this educational degree and forced her on us. And now he's given her the power to inspect other teachers? Hermione was breathing fast and her eyes were very bright. I can't believe this. It's outrageous. I know it is, said Harry. He looked down at his right hand, clenched upon the tabletop, and saw the faint white outline of the words Umbridge had forced him to cut into his skin. But a grin was unfurling on Ron's face. What? Said Harry and Hermione together, staring at him. Oh, I can't wait to see McGonagall inspected, said Ron happily. Umbridge won't know what's hit her. Well, come on, said Hermione, jumping up. We better get going. If she's inspecting Bin's class, we don't want to be late. But Professor Umbridge was not inspecting their history of magic lesson, which was just as dull as the previous Monday. Nor was she in Snape's dungeon when they arrived for double potions, where Harry's Moonstone essay was handed back to him with a large, spiky black D scrawled in an upper corner. I have awarded you the grades you would have received if you presented this work for your OWL, said Snape with a smirk as he swept among them, passing back their homework. This should give you a realistic idea of what to expect in your examination. Snape reached the front of the class and turned to face them. The general standard of this homework was abysmal. Most of you would have failed had this been your examination. I expect to see a great deal more effort for this week's essay on the various varieties of venom antidotes, or I shall have to start handing out detention to those dunces who get D's. He smirked as Malfoy sniggered and said in a carrying whisper, Some people got D's? Harry realized that Hermione was looking sideways to see what grade he had received, and he slid his Moonstone essay back into his bag as quickly as possible, feeling that he would rather keep that information private. Determined not to give Snape an excuse to fail him this lesson, Harry read and reread every line of the instructions on the blackboard at least 3 times before acting on them. His strengthening solution was not precisely the clear turquoise shade of Hermione's, but it was at least blue rather than pink, like Neville's, and he delivered a flask of it to Snape's desk at the end of the lesson with a feeling of mingled defiance and relief. Well, that wasn't as bad as last week, was it? Said Hermione as they climbed the steps out of the dungeon and made their way across the entrance hall toward lunch. And the homework didn't go too badly either, did it? When neither Ron nor Harry answered, she pressed on. I mean, all right, I didn't expect the top grade, not if he's marking to owl standard, but a pass is quite encouraging at this stage, wouldn't you say? Harry made a non-committal noise in his throat. Of course, a lot can happen between now and the exam. We've got plenty of time to improve, but the grades we're getting now are sort of a baseline, aren't they? Something we can build on. They sat down together at the Gryffindor table. Obviously, I'd have been thrilled if I'd gotten an O. Hermione, said Ron sharply, if you want to know what grades we got, ask. I didn't mean... Well, if you want to tell me. I got a P, said Ron, ladling soup into his bowl. Happy? Well, that's nothing to be ashamed of, said Fred, who had just arrived at the table with George and Lee Jordan and was sitting down on Harry's right. Nothing wrong with a good, healthy P. But, said Hermione, doesn't P stand for... Poor, yeah, said Lee Jordan. Still better than D, isn't it? Dreadful? Harry felt his face grow warm and faked a small coughing fit over his roll. When he emerged from this, he was sorry to find out that Hermione was still full flow about OWL grades. So, top grade's O for outstanding, she was saying. And then there's A? No, E, George corrected her. E for exceeds expectations. And I've always thought Fred and I should have got E in everything because we exceeded expectations just by turning up for the exams. They all laughed except Hermione, who plowed on. So after E, it's A for acceptable, and that's the last pass grade, is it? Yep, said Fred, dunking an entire roll in his soup, transferring it to his mouth and swallowing it whole. Then you get P for poor. Ron raised both his arms in mock celebration. and D for dreadful. And then T, George reminded him. T? Said Hermione, looking appalled. Even lower than a D? What on earth does that stand for? Troll, said George promptly. Harry laughed again, though he was not sure whether or not George was joking. He imagined trying to conceal from Hermione that he had received T's in all his owls, and immediately resolved to work harder from now on. You lot had an inspected lesson yet? Fred asked them. No, said Hermione at once. Have you? Just now before lunch, said George. Charms. What was it like? Hermione and Harry asked together. Fred shrugged. Not that bad. Umbridge just lurked in the corner, making notes on a clipboard. You know what Flitwick's like. He treated her like a guest. Didn't seem to bother him at all. She didn't say much. Asked Alicia a couple of questions about what the class was normally like. Alicia told her they were really good. That was it. I can't see old Flitwick getting marked down, said George. He usually gets everyone through their exams all right. Who've you got this afternoon? Fred asked Harry. Trelawney. Ah, a T if I ever saw one. And Umbridge herself. Well, be a good boy and keep your temper with Umbridge today, said George. Angelina will do her nut if you miss any more Quidditch practices. But Harry did not have to wait for Defense Against the Dark Arts to meet Professor Umbridge. He was pulling out his dream diary in a seat at the very back of the shadowy divination room when Ron elbowed him in the ribs, and, looking around, he saw Professor Umbridge emerging through the trapdoor in the floor. The class, which had been talking cheerily, fell silent at once. The abrupt fall in the noise level made Professor Trelawney, who had been wafting about handing out the dream oracles, look around. Good afternoon, Professor Trelawney, said Professor Umbridge with her wide smile. You received my note, I trust, giving the time and date of your inspection? Professor Trelawney nodded curtly, and, looking very disgruntled, turned her back on Professor Umbridge and continued to give out books. Still smiling, Professor Umbridge grasped the back of the nearest armchair and pulled it to the front of the class so that it was a few inches behind Professor Trelawney's seat. She then sat down, took her clipboard from her flowery bag, and looked up expectantly, waiting for the class to begin. Professor Trelawney pulled her shawls tight about her with slightly trembling hands and surveyed the class through her hugely magnifying lenses. We shall be continuing our study of prophetic dreams today, she said in a brave attempt at her usual mystic tones, though her voice shook slightly. Divide into pairs, please, and interpret each other's latest nighttime visions with the aid of the oracle. She made as though to sweep back to her seat, saw Professor Umbridge sitting right beside it, and immediately veered left, toward Parvati and Lavender, who were already deep in discussion about Parvati's most recent dream. Harry opened his copy of the Dream Oracle, watching Umbridge covertly. She was making notes on her clipboard now. After a few minutes, she got to her feet and began to pace the room in Trelawney's wake, listening to her conversations with students and posing questions here and there. Harry bent his head hurriedly over his book. Think of a dream, quick, he told Ron, in case the old toad comes our way. I did last time, Ron protested. It's your turn. You tell me one. Oh, I don't know, said Harry desperately, who could not remember dreaming anything at all over the last few days. Let's say I dreamed I was drowning Snape in my cauldron. Yeah, that'll do. Ron chortled as he opened his dream oracle. Okay, we've got to add your age to the date you had the dream, the number of letters in the subject. Would that be drowning, or cauldron, or Snape? It doesn't matter, pick any of them, said Harry, chancing a glance behind him. Professor Umbridge was now standing at Professor Trelawney's shoulder, making notes while the divination teacher questioned Neville about his dream diary. What night did you dream this again? Ron said, immersed in calculations. I don't know, last night, whatever you like, Harry told him, trying to listen to what Umbridge was saying to Professor Trelawney. They were only a table away from him and Ron now. Professor Umbridge was making another note on her clipboard, and Professor Trelawney was looking extremely put out. Now, said Umbridge, looking up at Trelawney, you've been in this post how long exactly? Professor Trelawney scowled at her, arms crossed and shoulders hunched as though wishing to protect herself as much as possible from the indignity of the inspection. After a slight pause, in which she seemed to decide that the question was not so offensive that she could reasonably ignore it, she said in a deeply resentful tone, Nearly 16 years. Quite a period, said Professor Umbridge, making a note on her clipboard. So it was Professor Dumbledore who appointed you? That's right, said Professor Trelawney shortly. Professor Umbridge made another note. And you are a great-great-granddaughter of the celebrated seer Cassandra Trelawney? Yes, said Professor Trelawney, holding her head a little higher. Another note on the clipboard. But I think, correct me if I'm mistaken, that you are the first in your family since Cassandra to be possessed of second sight? These things often skip, 3 generations, said Professor Trelawney. Professor Umbridge's toad-like smile widened. Of course, she said sweetly, making yet another note. Well, if you could just predict something for me, then. She looked up inquiringly, still smiling. Professor Trelawney had stiffened as though unable to believe her ears. I don't understand you, said Professor Trelawney, clutching convulsively at the shawl around her scrawny neck. I'd like you to make a prediction for me, said Professor Umbridge very clearly. Harry and Ron were not the only people watching and listening sneakily from behind their books now. Most of the class were staring transfixed at Professor Trelawney as she drew herself up to her full height, her beads and bangles clinking. The inner eye does not see upon command, she said in scandalized tones. I see, said Professor Umbridge softly, making yet another note on her clipboard. But wait, said Professor Trelawney suddenly, in an attempt at her usual ethereal voice, though the mystical effect was ruined somewhat by the way it was shaking with anger. I think I do see something. Something that concerns you. Why, I sense something dark, some grave peril. Professor Trelawney pointed a shaking finger at Professor Umbridge, who continued to smile blandly at her, eyebrows raised. I'm afraid that you are in grave danger, Professor Trelawney finished dramatically. There was a pause. Professor Umbridge's eyebrows were still raised. Right, she said softly, scribbling on her clipboard once more. Well, if that's really the best you can do. She turned away, leaving Professor Trelawney standing rooted to the spot, her chest heaving. Harry caught Ron's eye and knew that Ron was thinking exactly the same as he was. They both knew that Professor Trelawney was an old fraud. But on the other hand, they loathed Umbridge so much that they felt very much on Trelawney's side. Until she swooped down on them a few seconds later, that was. Well, she said, snapping her long fingers under Harry's nose, uncharacteristically brisk. Let me see the start you've made on your dream diary, please. And by the time she had interpreted Harry's dreams at the top of her voice, all of which, even the ones that involved eating porridge, apparently foretold a gruesome and early death, he was feeling much less sympathetic toward her. All the while, Professor Umbridge stood a few feet away, making notes on that clipboard. And when the bell rang, she descended the silver ladder first, so that she was waiting for them all when they reached their Defense Against the Dark Arts lesson 10 minutes later. She was humming and smiling to herself when they entered the room. Harry and Ron told Hermione, who had been in arithmancy, exactly what had happened in divination, while they all took out their copies of Defensive Magical Theory, but before Hermione could ask any questions, Professor Umbridge had called them all to order, and silence fell. Wands away, she instructed them all smilingly, and those people who had been hopeful enough to take them out sadly returned them to their bags. As we finished Chapter 1 last lesson, I would like you all to turn to page 19 today and commence Chapter 2, Common Defensive Theories and Their Derivation. There will be no need to talk. Still smiling her wide, self-satisfied smile, she sat down at her desk. The class gave an audible sigh as it turned, as one, to page 19. Harry wondered dully whether there was enough chapters in the book to keep them reading all through this year's lessons, and was on the point of checking the contents when he noticed that Hermione had her hand in the air again. Professor Umbridge had noticed too, and what was more, she seemed to have worked out a strategy for just such an eventuality. Instead of trying to pretend she had not noticed Hermione, she got to her feet and walked around the front row of desks until they were face to face. Then she bent down and whispered so that the rest of the class could not hear, "What is it this time, Miss Granger?" "I've already read Chapter 2, said Hermione. "Well then, proceed to Chapter 3. "I've read that too. I've read the whole book." Professor Umbridge blinked, but recovered her poise almost instantly. "Well then, you should be able to tell me what Slinkhard says about counterjinxes in Chapter 15. "He says counterjinxes are improperly named," said Hermione promptly. "He says counterjinx is just a name people give their jinxes when they want to make them sound more acceptable." Professor Umbridge raised her eyebrows, and Harry knew she was impressed against her will. "But I disagree," Hermione continued. Professor Umbridge's eyebrows rose a little higher, and her gaze became distinctly colder. "You disagree?" "Yes, I do," said Hermione, who, unlike Umbridge, was not whispering but speaking in a clear, carrying voice that had now attracted the rest of the class's attention. "Mr. Slinkhard doesn't like jinxes, does he? But I think they can be very useful when they're used defensively." "Oh, you do you?" said Professor Umbridge, forgetting to whisper and standing straight up. "Well, I'm afraid it is Mr. Slinkhard's opinion, and not yours, that matters within this classroom, Miss Granger." "But," Hermione began. "That is enough," said Professor Umbridge. She walked back to the front of the class and stood before them, all the jauntiness she had shown at the beginning of the lesson gone. "Miss Granger, I'm going to take 5 points from Gryffindor House." There was an outbreak of muttering at this. "What for?" said Harry angrily. "Don't you get involved," Hermione whispered urgently to him. "For disrupting my class with pointless interruptions," said Professor Umbridge smoothly. "I am here to teach you using a ministry-approved method that does not include inviting students to give their opinions on matters about which they understand very little. Your previous teachers in this subject may have allowed you more license, but as none of them, with the possible exception of Professor Quirrell, who did at least appear to have restricted himself to age-appropriate subjects, would have passed a ministry inspection." "Yeah, Quirrell was a great teacher," said Harry loudly. "There was just the minor drawback of him having Lord Voldemort sticking out of the back of his head." This pronouncement was followed by one of the loudest silences Harry had ever heard. Then, "I think another week's detentions would do you some good, Mr. Potter," said Umbridge sleekly. The cut on the back of Harry's hand had barely healed, and by the following morning it was bleeding again. He did not complain during the evening's detention. He was determined not to give Umbridge the satisfaction. Over and over again he wrote, "I must not tell lies," and not a sound escaped his lips, though the cut deepened with every letter. The very worst part of this second week's worth of detentions was, just as George had predicted, Angelina's reaction. She cornered him just as he arrived at the Gryffindor table for breakfast on Tuesday, and shouted so loudly that Professor McGonagall came sweeping down upon the pair of them from the staff table. "Miss Johnson, how dare you make such a racket in the Great Hall? 5 points from Gryffindor! But Professor, he's gone and landed himself in detention again!" "What's this, Potter?" said Professor McGonagall sharply, rounding on Harry. "Detention? From whom?" "From Professor Umbridge," muttered Harry, not meeting Professor McGonagall's beady, square-framed eyes. "Are you telling me," she said, lowering her voice so that the group of curious Ravenclaws behind them could not hear, "that after the warning I gave you last Monday, you lost your temper in Professor Umbridge's class again?" "Yes," Harry muttered, speaking to the floor. "Potter, you must get a grip on yourself. You are heading for serious trouble. Another 5 points from Gryffindor." "What? But, Professor, no!" Harry said, furious at this injustice. "I'm already being punished by her. Why do you have to take points as well?" "Because detentions do not appear to have any effect on whatsoever," said Professor McGonagall tartly. "No, not another word of complaint, Potter. And as for you, Miss Johnson, you will confine your shouting matches to the Quidditch pitch in future, or risk losing the team captaincy." She strode back toward the staff table. Angelina gave Harry a look of deepest disgust and stalked away, upon which Harry flung himself onto the bench beside Ron, fuming. "She's taking points off Murtor because I'm having my hand sliced open every night? How is that fair? How?" "I know, mate," said Ron sympathetically, tipping bacon onto Harry's plate. "She's bang out of order." Hermione, however, merely rustled the pages of her Daily Prophet and said nothing. "You think McGonagall was right, don't you?" said Harry angrily to the picture of Cornelius Fudge obscuring Hermione's face. "I wish she hadn't taken points from you, but I think she's right to warn you not to lose your temper with Umbridge," said Hermione's voice, while Fudge gesticulated forcefully from the front page, clearly giving some kind of speech. Harry did not speak to Hermione all through Charms, but when they entered Transfiguration, he forgot his anger. Professor Umbridge and her clipboard were sitting in a corner, and the sight of her drove the memory of breakfast right out of his head. "Excellent," whispered Ron as they sat down in their usual seats. "Let's see Umbridge get what she deserves." Professor McGonagall marched into the room without giving the slightest indication that she knew Professor Umbridge was there. "That will do," she said, and silence fell immediately. "Mr. Finnegan, kindly come here and hand back the homework. Miss Brown, please take this box of mice. Don't be silly, girl, they won't hurt you. And hand one to each student." Said Professor Umbridge, employing the same silly little cough she had used to interrupt Dumbledore on the first night of term. Professor McGonagall ignored her. Seamus handed back Harry's essay. Harry took it without looking at him and saw, to his relief, that he had managed an A. "Right then, everyone listen closely. Dean Thomas, if you do that to the mouse again, I shall put you in detention. Most of you have now successfully banished your snails, and even those who are left with a certain amount of shell have the gist of the spell. Today we shall be..." said Professor Umbridge. "Yes," said Professor McGonagall, turning around, her eyebrows so close together they seemed to form one long, severe line. "I was just wondering, Professor, whether you received my note telling you of the date and time of your inspection." "Obviously I received it, or I would have asked you what you are doing in my classroom," said Professor McGonagall, turning it back firmly on Professor Umbridge. Many of the students exchanged looks of glee. "As I was saying, today we shall be practicing the altogether more difficult vanishment of mice. Now, the vanishing spell Ahem. I wonder, said Professor McGonagall in cold fury, turning on Professor Umbridge, how you expect to gain an idea of my usual teaching methods if you continue to interrupt me. You see, I do not generally permit people to talk when I am talking. Professor Umbridge looked as though she had just been slapped in the face. She did not speak, but straightened the parchment on her clipboard and began scribbling furiously. Looking supremely unconcerned, Professor McGonagall addressed the class once more. As I was saying, the vanishing spell becomes more difficult with the complexity of the animal to be vanished. The snail, as an invertebrate, does not present much of a challenge. The mouse, as a mammal, offers a much greater one. This is not, therefore, magic you can accomplish with your mind on your dinner. So, you know the incantation. Let me see what you can do. How can she lecture me about not losing my temperature with Umbridge? Harry said to Ron under his voice, but he was grinning. His anger with Professor McGonagall had quite evaporated. Professor Umbridge did not follow Professor McGonagall around the class as she had followed Professor Trelawney. Perhaps she thought that Professor McGonagall would not permit it. Instead, she did take many more notes while she sat in her corner, and when Professor McGonagall finally told them all to pack away, rose with a grim expression on her face. Well, it's a start, said Ron, holding up a long, wriggling mouse tail and dropping it back into the box Lavender was passing around. As they filed out of the classroom, Harry saw Professor Umbridge approach the teacher's desk. He nudged Ron, who nudged Hermione, in turn, and the three of them deliberately fell back to eavesdrop. How long have you been teaching at Hogwarts? Professor Umbridge asked. 39 years this December, said Professor McGonagall brusquely, snapping her bag shut. Professor Umbridge made a note. Very well, she said. You will receive the results of your inspection in 10 days' time. I can hardly wait, said Professor McGonagall in a coldly indifferent voice, and she strode off toward the door. Hurry up, you three, she added, sweeping Harry, Ron, and Hermione before her. Harry could not help giving her a faint smile, and could have sworn he received one in return. He had thought that the next time he would see Umbridge would be in his detention that evening, but he was wrong. When they walked down the lawns toward the forest for care of magical creatures, they found her and her clipboard waiting for them beside Professor Grubbly Plank. You do not usually take this class, is that correct? Harry heard her ask as they arrived at the trestle table, where the group of captive bowtruckles were scrabbling around for woodlice like so many living twigs. Quite correct, said Professor Grubbly Plank, hands behind her back and bouncing on the balls of her feet. I am a substitute teacher standing in for Professor Hagrid. Harry exchanged uneasy looks with Ron and Hermione. Malfoy was whispering with Crabbe and Goyle. He would surely love this opportunity to tell tales on Hagrid to a member of the Ministry. Said Professor Umbridge, dropping her voice, though Harry could still hear her quite clearly. I wonder. The headmaster seems strangely reluctant to give me any information on the matter. Can you tell me what's causing Professor Hagrid's very extended leave of absence? Harry saw Malfoy look up eagerly. Afraid I can't, said Professor Grubbly Plank breezily. Don't know anything more about it than you do. Got an owl from Dumbledore. Would I like a couple weeks' worth of teaching work? Accepted. That's as much as I know. Well, shall I get started then? Yes, please do, said Professor Umbridge, scribbling upon her clipboard. Umbridge took a different tack in this class and wandered among the students, questioning them on magical creatures. Most people were able to answer well, and Harry's spirits lifted somewhat. At least the class was not letting Hagrid down. Overall, said Professor Umbridge, returning to Professor Grubbly Plank's side after a lengthy interrogation of Dean Thomas, how do you, as a temporary member of the staff, an objective outsider, I suppose you might say, how do you find Hogwarts? Do you feel you receive enough support from the school management? Oh yes, Dumbledore's excellent, said Professor Grubbly Plank heartily. No, I'm very happy with the way things are run. Very happy indeed. Looking politely incredulous, Umbridge made a tiny note on her clipboard and went on. And what are you planning to cover with this class this year, assuming, of course, that Professor Hagrid does not return? Oh, I'll take them through the creatures that most often come up in OWL, said Professor Grubbly Plank. Not much left to do. They've studied unicorns and nifflers. I thought we'd cover porlocks and measles, make sure they can recognize krups and gnarls, you know. Well, you seem to know what you're doing at any rate, said Professor Umbridge, making a very obvious tick on her clipboard. Harry did not like the emphasis she put on you, and liked it even less when she put her next question to Goyle. Now, I hear there have been injuries in this class. Goyle gave a stupid grin. Malfoy hastened to answer the question. That was me, he said. I was slashed by a hippogriff. A hippogriff? Said Professor Umbridge, now scribbling frantically. Only because he was too stupid to listen to what Hagrid told him to do, said Harry angrily. Both Ron and Hermione groaned. Professor Umbridge turned her head slowly in Harry's direction. Another night's detention, I think, she said softly. Well, thank you very much, Professor Grubbly Plank. I think that's all I need to hear. You will be receiving the results of your inspection within 10 days. Jolly good, said Professor Grubbly Plank, and Professor Umbridge set off back across the lawn to the castle. It was nearly midnight when Harry left Umbridge's office that night, his hand now bleeding so severely that it was staining the scarf he had wrapped around it. He expected the common room to be empty when he returned, but Ron and Hermione had sat up waiting for him. He was pleased to see them, especially as Hermione was disposed to be sympathetic rather than critical. Here, she said anxiously, pushing a small bowl of yellow liquid toward him. Soak your hand in that. It's a solution of strained and pickled Murtlap tentacles. It should help. Harry placed his bleeding, aching hand into the bowl and experienced a wonderful feeling of relief. Crookshanks curled around his legs, purring loudly, and then leapt into his lap and settled down. Thanks, he said gratefully, scratching behind Crookshanks' ears with his left hand. I still reckon you should complain about this, said Ron in a low voice. No, said Harry flatly. McGonagall would go nuts if she knew. Yeah, she probably would, said Harry. And how long do you reckon it'd take Umbridge to pass another decree saying anyone who complains about the High Inquisitor gets sacked immediately? Ron opened his mouth to retort, but nothing came out, and after a moment he closed it again in a defeated sort of way. She's an awful woman, said Hermione in a small voice. Awful. You know, I was just saying to Ron when you came in, we've got to do something about her. I suggested poison, said Ron grimly. No, I mean something about what a dreadful teacher she is, and how we're not going to learn any defense from her at all, said Hermione. Well, what can we do about that? Said Ron, yawning. It's too late, isn't it? She got the job. She's here to stay. Fudge will make sure of that. Well, said Hermione tentatively, you know, I was thinking today. She saw a slightly nervous look at Harry and then plunged on. I was thinking that maybe the time's come when we should just do it ourselves. Do what ourselves? Said Harry suspiciously, still floating his hand in the essence of Murtlap tentacles. Well, learn Defense Against the Dark Arts ourselves, said Hermione. Come off it, groaned Ron. You want us to do extra work? Do you realize Harry and I are behind on homework again? It's only the second week? But this is much more important than homework, said Hermione. Harry and Ron goggled at her. I didn't think there was anything in the universe more important than homework, said Ron. Don't be silly, of course there is, said Hermione, and Harry saw with an ominous feeling that her face was suddenly alight with the kind of fervor that SPEW usually inspired in her. It's about preparing ourselves, like Harry said in Umbridge's first lesson, for what's waiting out there. It's about making sure we really can defend ourselves. If we don't learn anything for a whole year... We can't do much by ourselves, said Ron in a defeated voice. I mean, all right, we can go and look up jinxes in the library and try to practice them, I suppose. No, I agree. We've gone past the stage where we can just learn things out of books, said Hermione. We need a teacher, a proper one who can show us how to use the spells and correct us if we're going wrong. If you're talking about Lupin, Harry began. No, I'm not talking about Lupin, said Hermione. He's too busy with the Order anyway. The most we could see him is during Hogsmeade weekends, and that's not nearly often enough. Who then? Said Harry, frowning at her. Hermione heaved a very deep sigh. Isn't it obvious? She said. I'm talking about you, Harry. There was a moment's silence. A light night breeze rattled the window panes behind Ron, and the fire guttered. About me what? Said Harry. I'm talking about you teaching Defense Against the Dark Arts to us. Harry stared at her. Then he turned to Ron, ready to exchange the exasperated looks they sometimes shared when Hermione elaborated on far-fetched schemes like spew. To Harry's consternation, however, Ron did not look exasperated. He was frowning slightly, apparently thinking. Then he said, That's an idea. What's an idea? Said Harry. You, said Ron. Teaching us to do it. But... Harry was grinning now, sure the pair of them were pulling his leg. Well, but I'm not a teacher. I can't... Harry, you're the best in the year at Defense Against the Dark Arts, said Hermione. Me? said Harry, now grinning more broadly than ever. No, I'm not. You've beaten me in every test. Actually, I haven't, said Hermione coolly. You beat me in our third year. The only year we both sat the test and had a teacher who actually knew the subject. But I'm not talking about test results, Harry. Look at what you've done. How do you mean? You know what? I'm not sure I want someone this stupid teaching me, Ron said to Hermione, smirking slightly. He turned to Harry. Let's think, he said, pulling a face like Goyle, concentrating. First year, you saved the stone from you-know-who. But that was luck, said Harry. That wasn't skill. Second year, Ron interrupted, you killed the basilisk and destroyed Riddle. Yeah, but if Fawkes hadn't turned up, Third year, said Ron still louder, you fought off about 100 Dementors at once. You know that was a fluke. If the Time Turtle hadn't... Last year, Ron said, almost shouting now, you fought off you-know-who again. Listen to me, said Harry almost angrily, because Ron and Hermione were both smirking now. Just listen to me, all right? It sounds great when you say it like that, but all that stuff was luck. I didn't know what I was doing half the time. I didn't plan any of it. I just did whatever I could think of, and I nearly always had help. Ron and Hermione were still smirking, and Harry felt his temper rise. He wasn't even sure why he was feeling so angry. Don't sit there grinning like you know better than I do. I was there, wasn't I? He said heatedly. I know what went on all right, and I didn't get through any of that because I was brilliant at Defense Against the Dark Arts. I got through it all because help came at the right time, or because I guessed right. But I just blundered through it all. I didn't have a clue what I was doing. Stop laughing! The bowl of Murtlap essence fell to the floor and smashed. He became aware that he was on his feet, though he couldn't remember standing up. Crookshanks streaked away under the sofa. Ron and Hermione's smiles had vanished. You don't know what it's like! Neither of you! You've never had to face him, have you? You think it's just memorizing a bunch of spells and throwing them at him like you're in a class or something. The whole time you know there's nothing between you and dying except your own brains or guts or whatever. Like, you can think straight when you know you're about a second away from being murdered or tortured or watching your friends die. They've never taught us that in their classes, what it's like to deal with things like that. And you two sit there acting like I'm a clever little boy to be standing here alive, like Diggory was stupid, like he messed up. You just don't get it. That could just as easily have been me. It would have been if Voldemort hadn't needed me. We weren't saying anything like that, mate, said Ron, looking aghast. We weren't having a go at Diggory. We didn't... You got the wrong end of the... He looked helplessly at Hermione, whose face was stricken. Harry, she said timidly, don't you see? This is exactly why we need you. We need to know what it's really like facing him. Facing Voldemort. It was the first time she had ever said Voldemort's name. And it was this, more than anything else, that calmed Harry. Still breathing hard, he sank back into his chair, becoming aware as he did so that his hand was throbbing horribly again. He wished he had not smashed the bowl of Murtlap essence. Well, think about it, said Hermione quietly. Please? Harry could not think of anything to say. He was feeling ashamed of his outburst already. He nodded, hardly aware of what he was agreeing to. Hermione stood up. Well, I'm off to bed, she said in a voice that was clearly as natural as she could make it. Night. Ron had gotten to his feet too. Coming? He said awkwardly to Harry. Yeah, said Harry. In a minute. I'll just clear this up. He indicated the smashed bowl on the floor. Ron nodded and left. Reparo, Harry muttered, pointing his wand at the broken pieces of china. They flew back together, good as new, but there was no returning the Murtlap essence to the bowl. He was suddenly so tired that he was tempted to sink back into his armchair and sleep there, but instead he got to his feet and followed Ron upstairs. His restless night was punctuated once more by dreams of long corridors and locked doors, and he woke the next day with his scar prickling again.